The transformation is happening so quietly that most Americans have not noticed. No dramatic announcements, no angry press conferences, no ultimatums delivered on live television. Just a steady, systematic dismantling of economic ties that took a century to build. Canada is leaving, not with a declaration of independence, but with 1,000 small decisions that add up to something far more significant. New trade agreements signed with nations across the Pacific, infrastructure projects redirecting resources away from southern borders, diplomatic relationships deepening with countries Washington considers adversaries. And in the White House, behind closed doors, officials are beginning to understand that the closest ally America has ever had is walking away. The fear is not that Canada will become an enemy. The fear is something worse, that Canada will become irrelevant to American interests, while America becomes irrelevant to Canadian prosperity. The relationship between the United States and Canada has always been asymmetric. America is 10 times larger by population. Its economy dwarfs its northern neighbor. Its military could conquer Canadian territory in days if it ever chose to do so. For generations, this asymmetry defined the partnership. Canada accepted American leadership in exchange for American protection and American market access. The arrangement worked because both sides benefited, and because the alternative seemed unthinkable. Geography made the relationship inevitable. The longest undefended border in the world, integrated electricity grids, pipelines carrying oil in both directions, supply chains so intertwined that a single automobile part might cross the border 7 times during manufacturing. The two economies were not merely connected, they were fused. Separating them seemed as practical as separating conjoined twins. This fusion was formalized through trade agreements. The Auto Pact of 1965, the Free Trade Agreement of 1988, NAFTA in 1994, the USMCA in 2020. Each agreement deepened integration. Each agreement made the relationship more valuable to both parties. Each agreement assumed that integration would continue indefinitely. That assumption is now dead. The shift began before Trump returned to the White House, but his second term accelerated it beyond anything Ottawa had planned. The tariffs came first, steel and aluminum, then lumber, then dairy, then automobiles. Each round of tariffs was accompanied by rhetoric that treated Canada not as an ally, but as an adversary, a country taking advantage of American generosity, a nation that needed to be punished into submission. Canadian leaders responded with the traditional playbook: diplomatic protests, carefully calibrated retaliatory tariffs, appeals to shared values and shared history. The assumption was that the relationship would survive this turbulence as it had survived previous disputes. Trade conflicts between Canada and the United States were not new. They had always been resolved through negotiation. But this time was different. The demands from Washington were not about trade balances or market access. They were about sovereignty. America wanted Canada to align its foreign policy with American directives, to purchase military equipment exclusively from American contractors, to sever economic ties with China on American terms and American timelines, to accept American control over Canadian natural resources as a condition of continued market access. Prime Minister Carney recognized what previous Canadian leaders had been reluctant to acknowledge. The United States under Trump was not interested in partnership. It was interested in subordination. And subordination was not something Canada could accept and remain a sovereign nation. The strategy that emerged was never publicly announced. There was no speech declaring a new direction, no white paper outlining a pivot away from America. Instead, there was a series of decisions that individually seemed unremarkable, but collectively represented a fundamental reorientation of Canadian national strategy. The first priority was trade diversification. Canada needed markets that could absorb exports currently flowing to the United States. This meant Asia. This meant Europe. This meant anywhere that was not dependent on American goodwill. The negotiations with the European Union accelerated. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, signed years earlier, had never reached its full potential. Canadian officials began pushing for deeper integration, regulatory harmonization that would make Canadian products more competitive in European markets, investment frameworks that would attract European capital to Canadian industries. The goal was to make Europe a genuine alternative to American market access rather than a secondary consideration. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which America had abandoned under the first Trump administration, became newly significant. Canada was already a member of the successor agreement. Now it began leveraging that membership aggressively. Trade missions to Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and Malaysia multiplied. Canadian exporters received government support to develop Asian market expertise. The message from Ottawa was clear: learn to sell somewhere other than America. Then came the conversations with China. These conversations were politically explosive. Canada had spent years in a diplomatic freeze with Beijing following the detention of two Canadian citizens in apparent retaliation for the arrest of a Huawei executive. Public opinion toward China was deeply negative. Any rapprochement would face fierce domestic criticism. But Carney understood something that his critics did not. Canada could not diversify away from American dependence without engaging the largest economy in Asia. China was not optional. China was essential. The initial contacts were undeniable: academic exchanges, business delegations, cultural programs, nothing that could be characterized as a policy shift. But behind these public interactions, more substantive discussions were occurring. Canadian officials explored what a reset with Beijing might look like, what Canada would need to offer, what Canada could expect in return. The critical minerals sector became the focal point. Canada possesses enormous reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the materials essential for batteries, electronics, and advanced manufacturing. Both America and China desperately want access to these resources. For years, the assumption in Washington was that Canadian minerals would flow south. That assumption is no longer safe. Canadian officials began signaling that mineral export agreements would depend on the behavior of importing nations. Countries that treated Canada with respect would receive preferential access. Countries that imposed tariffs, that threatened economic coercion, that demanded subordination, would find their access restricted. The signal was aimed directly at Washington, and Washington received it. The infrastructure investments tell the story most clearly. For decades, Canadian transportation infrastructure has been oriented north-south. Highways running to American border crossings, pipelines carrying oil to American refineries, rail lines connecting Canadian resources to American markets. This orientation reflected economic reality. America was where the customers were. Now the orientation is shifting. The federal government announced major investments in Pacific port capacity, Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and new facilities further north. These ports will handle increased trade with Asia. They will reduce Canadian dependence on American transportation networks. The pipeline politics have reversed entirely. Projects designed to carry Alberta oil to American refineries face bureaucratic obstacles and funding challenges. Projects designed to carry oil westward to Pacific terminals where tankers can transport it to Asian markets receive expedited approval and government support. The electricity grid, long integrated with American systems, is being reconfigured. New transmission lines will connect Canadian provinces to each other rather than to American states. Quebec's hydroelectric surplus, which currently flows south to New England, may soon flow west to Ontario and Manitoba instead. The grid is being redesigned for Canadian self-sufficiency rather than continental integration. Each of these projects takes years to complete. The infrastructure of a century cannot be reoriented overnight. But the decisions being made now will determine the economic geography of the next century, and those decisions are pointing away from America. The diplomatic realignment is equally significant. Canada has traditionally coordinated its foreign policy closely with the United States, not identically, but within a range that Washington found acceptable. This coordination reflected genuine agreement on many issues and pragmatic recognition that divergence carried costs. That coordination is eroding. Canadian positions at the United Nations have begun diverging from American positions more frequently. Canadian diplomats are building relationships in regions where America's influence is contested. Canadian development assistance is flowing to countries that Washington has sanctioned or threatened. The Arctic has become a particular focus. Climate change is opening northern shipping routes and making Arctic resources accessible. Multiple nations have claims and interests in the region. America, Russia, China, and the Nordic countries are all positioning themselves. Canada has the longest Arctic coastline of any nation. For decades, it relied on American support to assert its Arctic sovereignty. Now it is building relationships with other Arctic nations directly. bilateral agreements with Norway and Denmark on resource management and shipping lanes, conversations with Russia about disputed boundaries that America insisted should remain frozen. These diplomatic initiatives do not make Canada an enemy of America. They make Canada an independent actor pursuing its own interests. For Washington, accustomed to Canadian deference, this independence feels like betrayal. The defense relationship is the most sensitive area of all. Canada and the United States share NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that has protected North American airspace for nearly 70 years. American and Canadian military personnel serve side by side. The integration is so deep that separating the two forces would be extraordinarily difficult. But even here, changes are occurring. Canada announced a significant increase in defense spending, but the procurement decisions have surprised Washington. Contracts that American manufacturers expected to win are going to European competitors. Canadian officials cite better terms, greater technology transfer, and reduced dependence on American supply chains as justifications. The NORAD modernization program, which both nations agreed was urgently necessary, has become contentious. Canada wants guarantees that American commanders will consult Canadian authorities before taking actions that affect Canadian territory. America wants operational flexibility that Canada finds unacceptable. The negotiations have stalled repeatedly. Some in Washington have begun asking questions that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. What if Canada is no longer a reliable defense partner? What if Canadian territory becomes a vulnerability rather than a buffer? What if the assumptions underlying North American security architecture no longer hold? These questions are being asked quietly, in classified briefings and closed-door meetings. But they are being asked, and the fact that they are being asked represents a transformation in how America thinks about its northern border. Trump's public response to Canadian distancing has been characteristically aggressive. He has threatened tariffs, sanctions, and economic retaliation. He has questioned Canadian loyalty. He has suggested that Canada needs America far more than America needs Canada. But the private response has been different. Intelligence assessments reaching the White House paint a concerning picture. Canada is successfully diversifying its trade relationships. Asian markets are absorbing Canadian exports that previously went south. European investment in Canadian industries is increasing. The leverage that America assumed it possessed is diminishing. The critical minerals issue has particularly alarmed American planners. The transition to electric vehicles, the expansion of renewable energy, the manufacturing of advanced electronics, all of these depend on materials that Canada possesses in abundance. If Canada redirects those materials to China, to Europe, to anyone other than America, the consequences for American industry would be severe. Some advisors have urged a different approach. Repair the relationship, offer concessions, treat Canada as the partner it has been for a century rather than the subordinate Trump wants it to become. This advice has not been followed. The president's instinct is confrontation, not conciliation. And so the confrontation continues while Canada quietly builds its alternatives. The economic data is beginning to reflect the shift. Canadian exports to the United States as a percentage of total exports have declined for 3 consecutive years. Exports to Asia have grown by double digits annually. Foreign direct investment from Europe has increased, while American investment has stagnated. The numbers are still small relative to the overall relationship, but trends matter, and the trend is unmistakable. Canadian public opinion has shifted in parallel with policy. Polls show that favorable views of the United States have collapsed to historic lows. A majority of Canadians now support reducing economic dependence on America, even if it means short-term costs. The political incentive for any Canadian leader to accommodate Washington has evaporated. The political incentive to demonstrate independence has never been stronger. This public sentiment gives Carney room to maneuver that his predecessors lacked. He can pursue diversification aggressively without facing domestic backlash. He can resist American demands without being accused of endangering the relationship. The relationship, in the eyes of most Canadians, is already endangered by American behavior. Resistance is not the problem. Resistance is the solution. The question that haunts American strategists is where this ends. Does Canada become a neutral nation, friendly but independent, like Switzerland or Sweden? Does it become part of an alternative bloc, aligned with European and Asian powers against American interests? Does it become actively hostile, using its geography and resources to constrain American options. None of these outcomes would have seemed possible a decade ago. All of them seem possible now. The range of futures has expanded dramatically, and most of those futures are worse for America than the partnership that is being abandoned. The deepest fear in Washington is not about trade balances or mineral access or defense cooperation. It is about demonstration effect. If Canada can successfully reduce its dependence on America, other allies will notice. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the European nations. All of them face similar pressure from Washington. All of them are calculating whether resistance is feasible. Canada is running the experiment. If it works, if Canada emerges from this period more prosperous and more secure, despite American hostility, the lesson will be unmistakable. American threats are survivable. American pressure can be resisted. American dominance is not inevitable. This is what keeps strategists awake at night. Not the loss of Canada specifically, though that loss is significant, but the loss of the assumption that allies have no choice but to comply. The assumption that has underlain American foreign policy for 80 years. The assumption that is being tested on America's northern border and may not survive the test. The transformation is quiet because that is how Canada operates. No drama, no confrontation for its own sake, just steady, methodical repositioning. Decisions made in bureaucratic offices and corporate boardrooms. Agreements signed without fanfare. Infrastructure built without speeches. By the time America fully recognizes what has happened, it may be too late to reverse. The ports will be built. The trade agreements will be signed. The relationships will be established. The integration that took a century to create will have been unwound. And Canada will have demonstrated something that America desperately did not want demonstrated. That there is life after American partnership. That the world's most powerful nation can be defied. That sovereignty is not a privilege granted by Washington, but a right that nations can claim for themselves. Trump wanted to make America feared. He succeeded. But fear does not create loyalty. Fear creates the search for alternatives, and Canada is finding them. The longest undefended border in the world remains undefended, but what it separates is no longer the same. Two nations that were once inseparable are learning to live apart. The marriage is not ending in divorce. It is ending in something quieter and perhaps more final: indifference. And that may be what frightens Washington most of all.